Suad gets that set up, just a official business. If you don't want to appear either your name or visually as a part of the recording, just know that we are recording at this moment. All right, so because of the slight delay, I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. This is our first hybrid experience back. We have our in-person group as well as the wonderful guests online. So thank you all for joining us in this sort of new experiment that I assume will continue much more in the near future. And I am very, very delighted to introduce our next speaker in the Language and Brain series, who's Lauren Salig. She is a third-year student, graduate student from the University of Maryland, who's visiting us for a week here at UF. And she is in the graduate program of the Neuroscience and Cognitive Science graduate program at the Maryland, co-advised by Jared Novick and Bob Slevik. And many of you may know that Jared Novick and I have had a ongoing collaboration now for many years. And I'm really happy that that's continued now with Lauren specifically, working on issues of cognitive control, attention, and bilingual code switching specifically. Lauren, in her 3 years already as a graduate student, has accumulated quite a number of awards, including the flagship fellowship from the University of Maryland for incoming students, a fellow in Maryland's NSF NRT training program, as well as an honorable mention in the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which is quite an accomplishment. Even before her time as a graduate student, she was a Fulbright Fellow as a teaching assistant in Argentina as well. She has 2 publications that are out, including one that I had the honor of being involved with and that I'm really proud of. And that really goes to show that these connections and these collaborations lead to very, very fruitful developments, even when they are across universities. That paper is kind of a higher level paper focused on a theoretical stance, and it was a real joy to work with Lauren. I think she's really, really a clear-headed thinker, and it's been a really great honor to be able to work with you to develop some new ideas on this front. She's also highly involved in service. This includes outreach. So yesterday, for example, we learned about some of the activities that she and her colleagues at Maryland are involved with in language science outreach activities with elementary school children. And she also does a lot of English tutoring, especially to English learners at various ages. So with that, I won't take up any more time. I just want to say thank you, Lauren, for coming to visit us. I hope this has been a wonderful visit thus far for you. And we're excited to hear about bilingual code switching, exploring variation in comprehension switch costs.
Good? Yes, I'm great. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much, Corey. I don't think I've ever had a proper introduction before. That was lovely. And it's been really great being here at UF so far, and also working with Jorge. He said I was co-advised, but actually really I'm sort of like triple advised. Jorge is also one of my advisors, although not technically on paper, in effort, definitely. Okay. Yep, so like Jorge said, I'm Lauren Salig. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland. So during this talk, if you have clarification questions, feel free to just raise your hand and we can get those sorted out. Zoom, I'm gonna try to monitor you, but if you have a very urgent question, just talk because we will hear you. But I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and hand raise functions. Okay, but for bigger questions, we'll hold those for the end. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing on bilingual code switching with Jorge and my advisors. And specifically, I'll be talking today about Spanish-English code switching. So I want to start by giving you a sense of my positionality in this work. So I've been learning English from birth and started learning Spanish in a classroom environment starting at age 12. So that's where I'm coming from here. Okay, great, and let's get started. So today I'm going to be talking about variation in comprehension switch costs for Spanish-English bilingual code switching. So I have a feeling that everyone in this room today already knows what I'm talking about when I'm talking about code switching. but typically I like to define it anyways. So today I'm specifically talking about intrasentential code switching. So I'm talking about those mid-sentence switches between languages. And specifically today we'll be talking about switches for sentences that start in Spanish and then they switch at some point into English. As I also think all of you know already, bilingual code switching is a really common phenomenon. So not all, but many bilinguals will code switch. It's not accidental, by which I mean bilinguals are very, very rarely slipping into the wrong language or the unintended language. So this is a communication techniques that bilinguals use with each other. And most importantly for us today, bilingual code switching is pattern-based, and we'll talk a lot more about that bit in particular. Okay. Another thing we know about code switching is that there are costs associated with it in comprehension. So what do I mean by switch costs? Today, we're mostly going to focus on thinking about this as bilinguals taking longer to read on average code switch sentences like la electricista tiene la box their tools than single language equivalents like the electrician has the box their tools or a fully Spanish comparison. But of course, you can also measure switch costs in other ways, right? So if you do a visual world eye tracking study, we can also see that bilinguals take a little longer to look to a target object after it's been named in a code switch context versus a single language context. We can also look at this in EEG, specifically with the late positive component. So we see lots of evidence that there are switch costs in comprehension. This is just a very small sample of studies, right? So there's like a very long list of studies where we're observing switch costs in comprehension and a handful of studies where we don't see switch costs at all. So what's up with that, right? Why do we see them sometimes and sometimes we don't? Like lots of things in science, the answer is it depends. And then the interesting question becomes, what does it depend on? And this is work that I'm really interested in. We're still figuring this out, but we already do know some things. So first of all, it seems to depend on code switching experience. So you might imagine that if you're a bilingual who code switches all the time, processing a code switch is going to be different for you than if you're a bilingual who never code switches. So that likely matters. We also know from some great work by Edith and colleagues that your interaction partner seems to matter, your interlocutor. So it would be a little odd, pragmatically not really licensed to code switch with monolinguals, but with bilinguals, that might be more pragmatically acceptable. And what I'm going to focus on today is the type of code switch. So like I said, code switching is pattern-based. So code switches tend to be more frequent in certain positions in a sentence than others. And that seems to matter for what magnitude of switch cost we observe. Okay. And 2 points here. So one, I'm referring to switch costs as costs. But I want to point out that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative thing. And in fact, I'm really interested in looking at benefits to code switching. I'm just using the term cost to express that there is a potentially processing difficulty or just perhaps taking longer, right? Which isn't necessarily good or bad. Okay. And what's interesting about studying this, right? So why do we care that code switches, that switch costs seem to differ in different contexts? Why do we care to figure out exactly when we see differences? Well, I'm in particularly interested in figuring out when code switching might be useful. For instance, when in a second language or a bilingual classroom, it might be useful to code switch. And so it's probably useful to understand exactly how the processing difficulties or just differences are, and when we're seeing different types of code switch processing before we start really advocating for integrating certain code switches in certain contexts. Okay. So to give you a roadmap for today, I'm going to be just talking about one study today that I did with Jorge and my advisors, but I'm going to break it up into 2 parts, and I'll spend almost all of our time on part 1 here. And so I'm going to be exploring natural variations in switch costs and specifically asking, do bilinguals experience reduced switch costs when they comprehend more frequent types of switches? If we have time for part 2, I'll get into looking at if we can experimentally modulate switch costs. And I'll explain that a little more further if and when we get there. Okay. Again, I'll just do a reminder of terms that less necessary for this group. But by code switches, I'm talking about the mid-sentence switches from Spanish to English. And by switch costs, in this context, I'm specifically talking about bilinguals taking longer to comprehend a code switch than a single language equivalent. Okay. So like I said, in part 1, we're going to be looking at natural variation in switch costs. And specifically, what I'm going to try to do is link production patterns to comprehension switch costs to try to explain some of that variation. And how we're going to do this is by using Mary Ellen McDonald's production distribution comprehension model. And this model is actually just a general language processing model. It was not designed necessarily with bilingual code switching in mind. And I'm just trying to ask, can we apply this general model to bilingual code switch comprehension? So to explain the model, it says that there are certain demands on production, and that results in certain constructions or forms being more frequent than others in production distributions. So this is the production, this is the distribution bit. So to give you a really brief example, we know that producers are under a lot of pressure, and that means that they tend to produce easier parts of sentences first, which leads to certain distributions in what we are exposed to in our language. And critically for us, the next piece of the model, the C piece, the comprehension piece, is that comprehenders come to implicitly learn these distributions that are in production and use them to guide their comprehension. So this is the part of the model that we'll be focusing on. Okay. And to summarize the main point of the model, it's that more frequent constructions in production should be easier to comprehend. I'm not going to give you an example of how this model has been applied because I think it'll get a little too nitty gritty, but to give you a sense, this is often applied to things like object relative clauses versus subject relative clauses. So what types of sentence structures are more or less easy to process in certain contexts. Okay, but my question today is, can we apply the PDC model to bilingual code switching? So do bilinguals experience reduced switch costs or even no switch costs when comprehending more frequent types of switches? Okay, so for the PDC model to apply here, at least two things need to be true. One, different code switch types need to have different production distributions. I've already told you that code switching is pattern-based, and I'll show you in a few slides too that this first condition is met. So there are different production distributions for different code switch types. The second thing that would have to be true for the PDC model to apply to code switch comprehension is that bilinguals would need to be able to track those distributions of when code switches occur. And this is not trivial, right? So the PDC model typically is applied to, like I said, things like sentence structure differences, so object relative clauses versus subject relative clauses, for example. And it's a little less clear if this is the type of information that people can track, right? So let's look at our example again. So when you get a code switch sentence like, la electricista tiene la box with her tools, when you get to box, if you compare that to the single language, fully in Spanish version, the meaning isn't really changing. The lexical properties aren't really changing for the most part, and the sentence structure really isn't changing either. So it's unclear if this is the type of distribution that people can track because so much is staying the same. Okay, ooh, sorry, we went way ahead. Okay. Great, okay. And so the question is, oh, great. Can bilinguals track this type of information, implicitly learn it, and then use it to guide their comprehension? Is that something that's happening or not? Okay, and so let's think about what's at stake here. So if the PDC model can explain a useful amount of variation in switch costs, that would imply that bilinguals can track these different distributions of when different types of code switches are occurring, and that they bring these expectations and this implicit learning to their interactions, to their comprehension. Okay. And there is some work, which I have cited down at the bottom here, to suggest that the PDC model does apply to bilingual code switching, which is all really great work. I love these papers, but all of them tend to do paired comparisons, right? So they're looking at feminine noun switches versus masculine noun switches, and just sort of really narrowly focused on specific types of switches without looking more broadly at if the PDC model seems to apply across a really wide range of different types of switches. And so the extent to which this model applies to bilingual code switch comprehension hasn't really been investigated on a broader scale. Okay, but what about if the PDC model does not explain that much switch cost variation? What would that mean? Well, to sort of rephrase it, it would mean that these production distributions or frequency in production is not really a useful predictor of switch cost magnitude. And instead, it might be that other factors are playing a much larger role. So the yes condition seems to imply that over lots of time, you do this implicit learning, and then you bring that learning to every interaction you have. You bring it to your comprehension all the time. But it might be possible that instead what's more important is each specific situation you're in, right? So it might be that it doesn't really matter what you've been exposed to your entire life. What matters is what the sentence that you're listening to now is. So what are you talking about? Who are you talking to? What is this specific sentence structure? Okay, so the question again, do bilinguals experience reduced switch costs in comprehending more frequent types of switches? We predicted that, yes. But before I show you our very specific predictions, I need to actually first show you that there are different production distributions so that I can tell you what exactly we were predicting. So we didn't collect our own production data. What we did instead was look at past corpora analyses, look at the distributions that existed there, and then use those to make predictions about comprehension. So first we started at sort of a very broad scale by looking at noun versus verb phrase code switches. So you can see in this purple bit here, the whole pie represents all of the interest-intentional switches from Spanish to English in this particular corpora, corpus. And you can see that it's really frequent that if you're going to get a code switch, it will be in a noun phrase. That's a very frequent type of switch. You can also get switches in verb phrases, but they are less frequent, right? And so this distribution will allow us to make a prediction about what's going to happen in comprehension, namely that noun phrase switches should be easier than verb phrase switches if the PDC model applies. If you're curious, the other section here is switches that occur literally anywhere else, adjectives, adverbs, conjunctions. Okay, so let's zoom in on this purple bit. So we also wanted to make predictions within these categories. So if we just look at switches that happen between the determiner and the noun, we see that in production, masculine determiner switches are way more frequent. So actually the example I've been giving you of la box is actually not a very frequent type of code switch. So it's much more frequent to get a masculine determiner like L. If you don't speak Spanish, you might be thinking, wow, where are all the feminine nouns in Spanish? Why are they all masculine? Well, this is actually an asymmetrical feature of code switching, at least in the parts of the United States. So you can do what we've shown so far, where you match the determiner gender to the gender that the noun would be in Spanish. That's acceptable for both masculine and feminine. But you can also use the masculine as sort of a default to be paired with any English noun, whereas this is not true for the feminine determiner. So that's why we're seeing this wild asymmetry here. Okay, great. So we'll be able to make a comprehension prediction based on that. And now finally, let's zoom in on our verb phrase, which is a little more. So this pie chart represents all of the Spanish to English code switches that happened within verb phrases that were either in the perfective tense or the progressive tense. And so, sorry, people online, you won't be able to see me point probably. But so if we just focus in on the switches that happen at the perfective tense, you can see it's a lot more common to get one at the auxiliary location here, like mis amigos have prepared, than at the participle location, like mis amigos han prepared. So that will allow us to make a prediction. And then if we just compare the perfective tense switches to the progressive tense switches overall, we can see that the progressive tense switches, this lighter orange here, is a lot more frequent than the perfective tense ones in the darker orange. So it's more likely you'll get a switch like mis amigos están preparing than mis amigos han prepared. And I just want to note that at least for this corpora, you can see that it also includes written stuff. So we're not just asking about speech and then seeing if that applies to reading, but these patterns seem to be existing in written text as well. Okay, so we want to test the PDC model. We've established that there are different distributions in production. And the next piece is asking, does that guide comprehension? Okay, so our specific predictions should not be surprising based on the distributions I just told you. So we expected noun switches to be easier than verb switches, meaning having a smaller switch cost. We expected masculine noun switches to be easier than feminine noun switches. Within perfective tense switches, we expected them to be easier at the auxiliary location, have prepared, than at the participle location, unprepared. And in general, we expected progressive tense switches, están preparing, to be easier than perfective tense switches, unprepared. Okay, and I'm going to tell you now because I'm going to forget later. We have 4 predictions, but we actually only run 3 models in analysis, right? So noun versus verbs, feminine versus masculine nouns, and then we put all the verbs together in one model. Okay. Any questions up to this point? All right, great. Okay, so let me tell you about what we did. We had 101 Spanish-English bilinguals. We recruited them via SONA, which is our university's recruitment system, but also just a lot more broadly via email listservs, social media. I think some of you here helped us recruit, so thank you if you were one of those people. And we found that our sample ended up being relatively balanced. The mean age of acquisition for English and Spanish was pretty young. We also asked them 4 1 to 5 Likert scale rating questions about their code switching experience. On average, they tended to respond about a 3 out of 5, so moderate code switchers, which is good for us. I'll also note that all the participants you're seeing here, all the 101, passed certain attention thresholds, which I can tell you more about if you care about that. And I'll also mention that the study was pre-registered. The OSF link is here, which basically means that before we actually collected data and analyzed it, we wrote out what our plan was ahead of time and posted that on OSF. Okay. So once we had these people, they participated remotely on their own devices on their own time. And what they did was self-paced reading of sentences. If you're not familiar with that, they basically read a sentence word by word and they press a button when they're ready to see the next word. It looks something like this, not exactly, but la electricista tiene la box with her tools. So they go through word by word.
But they don't have a preview of the shape of the next word or the length of the next word.
They do actually, yeah, which is why I said it's not exactly like this, yeah. Okay, yep. And the sentences could either be code switched. Code switches were always Spanish to English, or the sentences could be in a single language. Based on each individual participant, they either saw all of their single language sentences in Spanish or all of them in English. Even though the split for our critical sentences that we cared about was 50% code switches, 50% single languages, when we added in filler sentences across the board, we made it so that only about 1/3 of the sentences they were seeing were code switched to make it a little more in alignment with what we see in natural corpora. Okay, yeah.
So you said each participant saw the code switch sentences meant either Spanish or English, or?
Yes, so throughout the experiment, they're seeing sentences. Yeah. If it was a single language sentence, for some participants, all of those were in English, and for other participants, all of them were in Spanish.
What was the rationale behind this decision?
We didn't care about between sentence switches. We only cared about within sentence switches, and we wanted to be able to compare them to, so all of our switches were Spanish to English. So we wanted to be able to compare them to fully English sentences, right? Because then the exact wording is the same, just in different contexts. But we were also curious about how having Spanish as the comparison would go to sort of factor in other things, like our participants tended to be much faster at reading in English. So we wanted to see if we got a switch cost at all when we compared Spanish to English to Spanish. Also, there is the matter of it being predictive, which I think in our analyses we figured out didn't end up being a problem. But so if you're a participant and you are seeing all of your sentences in English, if you get a code switch sentence, it starts in Spanish and then switches to English. So they would know with 100% certainty if they saw Spanish that it was going to switch into English. It turns out we didn't see any that like negatively affecting our results, but we wanted to be sure, so we could look at our people who were reading entirely in Spanish, so that for them, when a sentence starts in Spanish, well, all of the sentences start in Spanish. They can't predict if a code switch is coming or not.
But the analysis was done on all the algorithm of the participants.
Yes, yeah. But with it, so we do regression, so we had it included as a factor, what their single language sentences were in.
Yeah. Yeah. I have common, but maybe we can.
Great, yeah. I can also show you the exact models if you're interested at the end. Okay. Okay, great, yep. This is also interspersed with some other tasks. I don't think we'll get to part 2, but if we did, I could tell you a little bit more about the other tasks. Okay, so our main question was about explaining variation in switch costs. And in order to be able to do that, first we need to have switch costs to vary. So first, I just want to assure you that we did see switch costs. Our region to analyze was the switch itself. So here the word box and then the 2 subsequent words. And you can see here, you're just looking at raw reading time. So it's a little bit difficult to tell, but you can see that reading times are higher. So longer for code switched words shown in green. Here I'm showing you the words separated out. So this would be box with her. But in the analyses, you'll see them all sort of crammed together as this was our region of interest. You'll probably notice we're seeing a switch cost at the switch itself and 1 word after, so a little bit of spillover. We aren't really seeing that 2 words after anymore, but it is included in all of the analyses because that's how it is pre-registered. Okay, so let me show you the interesting results. Our first prediction was that noun switches would be easier than verb switches, meaning that there would be a smaller switch cost. Here on the y-axis, we're looking at our measure of switch cost. So our model didn't actually have the outcome of switch cost. It had the outcome of reading time. And specifically, it was the predicted logged reading time. And so what we did was took the predicted logged reading time for code switch segments and subtracted it from predicted logged reading time for single language sections. And that's how we're getting this measure of a switch cost. Okay, so the prediction was that more frequent switches, nouns shown in the orange color here, would be easier to comprehend, smaller switch costs than the verbs, which are less frequent. And that's exactly what we see when we're comparing to English. So in that sense, the PDC model seems to be applying here. When we compare to Spanish, we aren't seeing switch costs anymore at all. And again, this was sort of an interesting quality of our participants, just the sample we got, where they read so much faster in English. And so when we compare, so what we're comparing in the Spanish section here, when we're comparing switches to Spanish, the switch is actually an English region, right? So it's an English region in a code switch sentence as compared to a Spanish region in the same equivalent sentences. And what we saw happen time and time again when we made this comparison is that when people are reading in Spanish and then they hit the English part, they tend to keep the same reading time. And then in a few words, they start to really speed up. And so that's, we think, why we aren't really seeing as many effects when we compare to Spanish. Okay. But overall, okay, I see a question in the chat, which okay, yep, good, I'm glad that was answered. This is the analysis, yes. Okay. Our second prediction was that masculine noun switches would be easier than feminine ones, or again, have a smaller switch cost. So we expected this orange bar, the more frequent type of switch, to be lower, having a smaller switch cost than the feminine ones shown in green, which were less frequent. And we did not see this. So let me show you the stats. So we didn't see the expected effect here, which I think is really interesting. I have some thoughts about why, but I'm going to show you the rest of the results first. But just note for this one, we aren't seeing the predictions come to fruition in the data. Yeah.
Do you have a breakdown for the people who did compared to English and compared to Spanish?
No, because for this one, that interaction was not significant. Yeah, it was only actually significant for that first one. I could easily show you if you want, I just don't have the graph made. Yeah. Okay, so verbs. Our next prediction that was within perfective tense verb switches, it would be easier at the auxiliary location, which is more frequent, shown in this tiny orange bar here, as compared to at the participle location, which is less frequent, shown in the green bar. You can see we're really strongly seeing the effect that we expected. So we're actually seeing no switch cost at all when the switch is at the auxiliary location, and a pretty big switch cost when it's at the participle location. Interestingly, this was true for perfective switches and progressive switches. So we had predicted based on the corpora that it would just be for perfective ones, but actually applied to both. Okay. Our fourth prediction was that overall, progressive switches would be easier than perfective ones because they are more frequent. again, we're really strongly seeing the predicted effect. So in the more frequent orange bars, the progressive tense switches, we're basically seeing no switch cost or a very small one, but a large switch cost for the less frequent perfective switches. Okay. Great. So to go through our predictions, we thought that noun switches would be easier than verbs. And we saw that that was mostly true. It seemed to depend on what we compared it to, but the evidence we found that was significant was aligning with the PDC model predictions. Within the noun switches, we looked at masculine versus feminine, and we did not find the predicted effect. There seemed to be no difference in switch cost between the masculine and feminine ones. For verbs, again, we saw auxiliary location was easier, smaller switch cost than at the participle location, both for perfective and progressive switches. And across the board, progressive switches, which are more frequent, were easier than perfective ones. So we got a lot of checks here, a lot of evidence in support of the PDC model applying, and this one big X, which is sort of surprising, because if you remember that distribution, this is our most asymmetrical distribution. Masculine switches are way more frequent than feminine ones. So what is going on here? One possibility is that our measure wasn't sensitive enough, self-paced reading online, remotely, maybe we weren't getting enough sensitivity, but I think that's likely not it since we are seeing results in the other areas. Another possibility is that it has to do with the production distributions. So we are assuming that the production distributions that we see in the corpora are aligning with what our participants were exposed to. A critical part of the PDC model is that these production distributions exist, and then critically, people are exposed to them, learn them, and then they bring them to comprehension. So if they weren't actually exposed to the production distributions that we thought they were, then they wouldn't be showing the effects. But there is a third explanation that I think is even more interesting. And to get at it, I'm going to review a study that Jorge and colleagues published in 2017. This was an eye tracking study. It was a visual world study. So participants are looking at objects on the screen. And the participants were Spanish monolinguals and Spanish English bilinguals. So they're hearing a sentence and then they get a feminine determiner. Everyone, Spanish monolinguals, Spanish English bilinguals, anyone who speaks Spanish is pretty sure that the next thing that is coming up is a noun that would be feminine in Spanish. So they see that people start looking at nouns on the screen that would be feminine in Spanish. And in the other condition, they're hearing a sentence and then they get a masculine determiner. For the Spanish monolinguals, this is exactly the same. They know when they hear a masculine determiner in Spanish, what's coming next is a masculine noun. So they start looking at nouns on the screen that would be masculine. But the Spanish English bilingual code switchers don't do this. And if we go back to our distribution, we can think about why. So for Spanish English bilinguals, when they hear a masculine determiner, what could come next is a masculine noun in Spanish, sure, or any noun at all in English. If there's going to be a code switch, anything could come next. And so we see that they aren't narrowing down their predictions about what the next word is right away. Not when they hear that determiner, they need more information. Okay, so to return to our study, what makes comprehension easier? Well, it might be that the masculine noun switches actually are getting a boost from the PDC model. They're more frequent and that does make them easier to comprehend. But the feminine ones, despite being not frequent at all, pretty infrequent, have this great predictive value. So you know when you get a feminine determiner, you can really restrict what's coming next. You can make better predictions. So it might be that they're getting a boost from different things. And that's why we're seeing no difference at all, but actually it might be two different effects happening at the same time. Okay, so to conclude part one, we saw that production patterns from prior corpora could explain some variation in comprehension costs as the PDC model would predict. And so it seems that bilinguals are able to track this type of distribution and use it to guide their comprehension. Of course, other factors are also at play, right? So we're not claiming that this is the only thing that matters by any means. Like I just showed you with the determiner nouns, we think other things are going on too. But this does seem to be something that bilinguals are bringing with them to comprehension and using to guide their comprehension. Okay, let's see. Okay, how much time do we have left?
I'd say 10 minutes.
Okay, should we use that for questions or?
You can have, say, 10 minutes for talking and then we can extend it like 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, great. Then I will go through part two somewhat quickly. So From part one, we know that there are differences in switch costs based on switch type, right? So some switches do seem to take longer than others. Some seem to be harder, so to speak, than others. And so given that, can we reduce that at all? Can we bring the switch costs down or even eliminate them by doing some sort of manipulation? And we did this, or attempted to do this, by doing a cognitive control manipulation. So cognitive control is the cognitive mechanism that allows us to detect and resolve conflict in information processing. And it does this by promoting task-relevant information over task-irrelevant information. Cognitive control is important for lots of things. I won't get into it here, but it's an important ability that we all have. In the lab, what we do to manipulate the need for cognitive control, one way we do that is with the flanker task, which I have shown 2 trials of here. So participants' job in the flanker task is to tell us which direction the central arrow is pointing. So in this one up here, the correct answer would be right, because the middle arrow is pointing right. The flanking arrows are also pointing right, so there's no conflict here. This is an easy or congruent trial. But in this bottom one, they still have to respond right, even though all the flanking arrows are pointing left. There's a lot of conflicting information here. And so when bilinguals, or anyone, get a flanker trial like this, they need to engage their cognitive control, increase how engaged their cognitive control is in order to respond correctly. Okay. And there is some evidence already in papers I've cited down here, happy to talk about it more, that cognitive control might be involved in code switch comprehension. And so we asked, can we reduce switch costs when we put bilinguals in a state where that is conducive to resolving conflict? So if we have bilinguals engage cognitive control right before they read a code switch, is that code switch going to be easier for them? So to show you the methods, again, this is the same exact study as part one. I'm just showing you some of the tasks we had interleaved. So in one condition, we had bilinguals do an incongruent flanker trial, which we know engages cognitive control. So they get this flanker trial, they need to engage cognitive control in order to respond correctly. And then immediately afterwards, we have them read a sentence. And we know from past studies too, that there are sort of spillover effects here, and that once you engage cognitive control on this trial, we can reasonably expect it to still be engaged on the next trial. Okay, and we compare this to conditions where they do a congruent flanker trial, which we know does not really, it's not very cognitive control demanding. They don't really need to increase their cognitive control too much before they read that sentence. Okay, so here I'm going to show you some fake data about what we expect it to see. And again, here we're looking at reading times in that same critical region I showed you earlier, and we're just asking, does the flanker trial that they got previously affect that? So the outcome here is still reading time in that region. So if you get a sentence that's entirely in one language, these sentences aren't garden path sentences. They don't have conflict built into them intentionally. So whether or not you have cognitive control engaged before you encounter it shouldn't really matter. But we still expect there to be a switch cost, right? So code switch sentences taking longer than single language sentences. And critically, we expect to be able to reduce that switch cost if bilinguals engage cognitive control beforehand. So the darker bars here are representing incongruent trials that they got before they did the reading, or they engage cognitive control. And the lighter bars represent lower cognitive control engagement, but congruent trials beforehand. So this is what we expected. What we found was not bad at all. So again, it's hard to see here because I have the reading time, raw reading time for 3 words stacked on top of each other, but it's the same data as before. So these green bars, the code switches, are higher than the blue bars. We are seeing switch costs. But you can see that whether they had a congruent trial before in the light colors or the incongruent ones before in the dark colors doesn't seem to matter. So we expected critically this dark green bar to be lower than the light green bar, and we aren't actually observing that. Okay. And I'll just note that this was also true for a more complicated model than I'm showing here that included switch type in the model for ones that included sort of individual language history in the model. It didn't seem to matter. This interaction was not there. So we didn't find any evidence that having cognitive control beforehand engaged before you encounter the code switch reduces switch costs. This doesn't mean that it's impossible to reduce switch costs, right? So cognitive control is a very specific thing. It only helps you reduce conflict. So it could be that in this case, helping to reduce the conflict isn't going to help you read the sentence any faster. Or it could be that here we actually truly don't have a sensitive enough measure. So whereas before we're looking at self-paced reading, just looking at different types of code switches, here we're looking for an interaction with self-paced reading. So it might be that we do need a more sensitive measure here. And in the future, we're actually redoing the study with eye tracking right now. And I'm also working on some new work that asks, does comprehending a code switch capture or reorient attention in some way? So looking at other cognitive processes beyond cognitive control. So to wrap up, in line with the production distribution comprehension model, production patterns can help explain some variability in switch costs, which tells us that bilingual listeners do seem able to track the frequency of different types of code switches. And I'll also note from part 2 of the study that I personally believe that it is worth investigating how bilingual language processing interacts with other cognitive processes like cognitive control, like attention. So I definitely don't take this null result to mean that it's not interesting to look at that. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge Jorge, Bob, Jared. All of this work was done in collaboration with them, and also thank all these other people who helped make this work possible. I'll also let you all know if any of you online and also all of you in person are at UF. I'm here until next Thursday morning, March 24th. So if you want to talk more beyond our 10-minute question period, I'm happy to meet up. All right.
Lauren, obviously, I'm just going to let you field questions, especially since I